Okay, Genesis chapter 39. I'm going to begin at verse 1, and we're going to read through the entire chapter together. This is how it starts. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessings of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, Joseph was well-built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your servant treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. This is such a tremendous story. Last week, if you're here, we began to talk about this, that if you read the beginning of the book of Genesis, whether it's Noah or Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, the book of Genesis is filled with big manifestations of God. There are angels, there are visions, there are voices, big ways that God shows up, and it's obvious. Then you get to Joseph's story, which is the last story in the book of Genesis. It starts in chapter 37, and it's remarkable how quiet and hidden God is. And at the end of the book of Genesis, a big point is made that God's hiddenness is not his impotence. And the fact that he's quiet doesn't mean that he's not powerfully active, because we're going to see that, in fact, in the midst of his quietness, he's powerfully active. Now, just some details, because I think as we go through these chapters together, it's good to just take stock of these things. One is, and you can't miss it, that chapter 39 is just like chapter 37. In fact, when you read chapter 39, you should say to yourself, boy, that sounds just really familiar. I think I just pretty much read almost exactly the same story. So let's just check out the similarities. First, Joseph, who's doing very, very well, gets caught off in a remote place by himself. That's one of the similarities. Last week, if you were here, you remember he went to check on his brothers in Shechem. Shechem was a very populated place, but the brothers, for whatever reason we don't know, had decided to move on to Dothan, which was a remote place where they could do what they were going to do without people taking stock. And Joseph followed them to Dothan. He was kind of caught by himself out there, and they could grab hold of him, throw him into a pit, and sell him off without anyone really knowing. Here in this story, he's doing well, but he gets caught by himself. Remember what we just read? Potiphar's wife was inside the house, and when he went in to do his duties, there was no one else in there, and that's when she grabbed hold of his cloak and made all the accusations. So I was put in a remote place. It's interesting, in both cases there's deception. So remember the brothers go home and they say, look, Jacob, father, he must have been torn apart by wild beasts, and they deceive their father and make their father think that he's dead. There's deception here as well. She says to both her servants and then ultimately to Potiphar, hey, this guy came to take advantage of me. He's come here to make sport of me. And so there's a false accusation. And you can't miss this. I mean, this is so in your face. I just had to do this. Back behind the stage here, we just, for whatever purposes, have these Bible clothes that we wear, especially for children's ministry from time to time. I'm not going to put it on now. Don't get any thoughts. Anyway, you have to see this visually, which is why I grabbed it. In chapter 37, the brothers use his cloak. Remember the coat of many colors, the richly ornamented garment? They use the cloak to deceive their father. They get goat's blood on it, and they come to the father and say, look, you got to just look, his cloak, he must have been torn to pieces. And so they deceive the father. Now we're in chapter 39. Joseph, fled, leaving his cloak behind, and Potiphar's wife, you can just picture it. She's like, look, his cloak. He came in here to make sport of me and take advantage of me. See, same thing. And what's the result? Well, in chapter 37, the son who was highly favored winds up in a pit. He's, down at the bottom, so to speak. And here, in chapter 39, the servant who's highly favored winds up where? In prison. It's the same theme again. Why? I think so that we who read it will say, wow, now this is true to life. I think many of us will have had these experiences in life where we just feel like, here's the phrase, life is beating us down. I'm sure many of us have uttered these words, I can't catch a break. Just when we think it's going to go well, wham, life beats us down. And that, in essence, is what's happening here. Something terrible happens, he just thinks he's going to catch a break. No, he gets beat down again. And so, anyway, chapter 37 and chapter 39, you just have to see this. 39 looks back to chapter 37, the same themes, the same false accusations, the same deception, a cloak used in both places. From top to bottom, here's a guy who's he can't catch a break. He's being beat down, and yet, you can't miss, there's another theme. Despite the fact that he's being beat down quietly, it's hidden, it's subtle. It's not loud voices, it's not angels, it's not visions. Quietly, God's there, working through it all. Now, this chapter in particular is really a chapter about temptation. And there's one big obvious temptation, which we'll talk about, but I think actually if you look carefully at this passage, there's really three temptations that Joseph faces. The first temptation he faces, I'll call it a temptation of power. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The second one's more obvious. It's a sexual temptation. But there's a third temptation, which might be the most difficult to face. I'll call it the temptation to despair. And I believe that Joseph actually, if you look at this chapter, faced all three: power, sexual temptation, and then maybe the most difficult of all, the temptation to despair. Let's take them one at a time. I'm going to spend the least amount of time on the first one, the temptation to power, but I should mention it. If you look with me at verse 1, it becomes clear that Joseph, when he got taken down to Egypt, was sold to a man named Potiphar. And verse 1 specifically says this, that he's one of Pharaoh's officials, and he's the captain of the guard. The original Hebrew word, really, it means something like this, general. And it's clear from this passage that Potiphar's, well, he's not nobody. In fact, he's somebody really important. In fact, the kind of idea you get as you read the story was that he may very well have been Pharaoh's top general in charge of all the armed forces. And so this was a really powerful guy, and it just so happened that Joseph got sold into his house. I mean, you can see his house. He's got servants, and he's an entire household. He's an important, noble guy, Potiphar. And if you look at verse 4, it says Joseph found favor in his eyes. The language here might be a little misleading. It says, and became his attendant. You might think, oh, well, that's a pretty low position. No. In fact, it's clear that that word, it probably means something like this. He became the chief operating officer of his house. In fact, if you look at the rest of the verse, it says Potiphar put him in charge of his household. He entrusted to his care everything he owned. So Potiphar, really important guy, top general in Egypt. Joseph, somehow or another, as he got sold into slavery, wound up in Potiphar's house, and he rose the rank to the place where he had a place of power, the chief operating officer of Potiphar. And he had power. Everything in that household was under his care. Potiphar didn't concern himself with anything that was happening there. He had real power. There's a contrast in this chapter between two people and how they used their power. One person is Joseph. We can see how he used his power. Another person is Potiphar's wife, also a person of power. I mean, she's the wife of this noble general. And how do they both use their power? Well, in Potiphar's wife's case, she uses her power self-interestedly. It's for self. It's for her. It's about her pleasure. It's about her wants. It's about her desires. And she'll stop at nothing to make everything more or less about her. On the other hand, Joseph, instead of making everything about him, he is giving himself and blessing others. And maybe I'll just, because I don't want to spend too much time on this, I'll just put it this way. All of us have some amount of power. I mean, in whatever situation God's given us. And we all face a choice. We can use that power either to serve ourselves or to serve others. Whatever station you've been put in life, whatever authority you have, whatever monetary resources or other resources, you have a certain amount of power, and that temptation is always there. You can use it either to serve self or to serve others. That's the first temptation. I'm not going to say any more. The second temptation. This is the most obvious one, the plainest. It's in your face. You can say at the end of verse 7, really at the end of verse 6, it says, now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, and this translation's a little whitewashed, come to bed with me. The original Hebrew is just two Hebrew words, and I guess if I did my best to translate it, this is what she said, sex now. She was demanding sex now. That's the original Hebrew. I guess when translators translate the Bible, they sort of come to bed with me. It wasn't as romantic as it sounds. Anyway, sex now. And how does Joseph respond? Well, he has a care and concern for his master. His master's been good to him. He's seen that God has been with him, and he's risen in that household. And it's clear also that he has a regard for God, because look how he responds. In the middle of verse 9, it says, look, verse 9, no one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. Now check these words out. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God. So, there's a young man, well-built, handsome, but he sees it clearly. What she's requesting, what she's commanding, what she's wanting is a wicked thing and a sin against God. What I'd like to do, just because we're talking about this temptation, is spend a little time talking about the Bible's sexual ethic. One of the reasons I want to do that is because in the book of 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul, he actually, I'm certain of it, has this story in mind as he talks to the Corinthian church about the Christian sexual ethic. And I'm going to just put on the screen here some verses from 1 Corinthians chapter 6. By the time I read the last line, you'll see how it's related to this chapter. This is what the Apostle Paul says. He says, "Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit." And then it says, "Flee from sexual immorality." So you see the connection. Joseph, when she came and said, "Sex now," he's out of there. He fled. And Paul says, that's right. That's what you should do too. When confronted with a sexual temptation, you should flee from sexual immorality. These verses, I think, are important verses to spend a little time talking about. What is the idea of sex in the Bible? Well, the idea of sex in the Bible is that it's a wonderful gift. It's a great thing. But it's to be used in a very particular way within the context of marriage. And this passage, it speaks about kind of the idea in the Bible, the two will be one flesh. And when the Apostle Paul quotes that, he's actually quoting from the book of Genesis, which is a story of Adam and Eve. When God made Adam, and then subsequently he made Eve, he showed Eve to Adam, and he actually broke out in the first love poem in the Bible. He says, "Wow, this is great. This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She'll be called woman, for she was taken out of man." And then the Bible makes a comment. It says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will be," it says, "one flesh." And here's the idea of marriage in the Bible. I'd like to just, for the sake of clarity, talk it all the way through. The idea of the Bible is this, that God made this one special relationship, marriage, where a husband and wife come together, they're united to one another, and he made it so that that relationship would reflect the relationship that he has with his people. And as a result, that one special relationship, marriage, is called a covenant relationship. What's a covenant relationship? Covenant relationship is a personal relationship that is so deep, so intense, that in addition to all the intensity of the emotions and everything else, you add the force of law, calling upon God, calling upon the state to enforce a promise and an oath that you make to one another. Sometimes when I talk about covenant relationships, I like to contrast them with what I call consumer relationships. What's a consumer relationship? Well, almost all the relationships we have are consumer relationships. As an example, I am a consumer at my grocery store, at a gas station, at my bank, all kinds of places. And the grocery store I almost always go to. I like to go to it because it's close to my house. I like to go to it because it's convenient. I like to, a whole bunch of reasons. But I don't have to continue to go there. If another grocery store opens up that offers better quality for less price or whatever, I'm under no obligation whatsoever to continue my relationship with that particular grocery store. I can simply go to the other one. I mean, it has to do with my wants as a consumer. And listen, even friendships we have in this world are just like that. Why do we become friends with people? Well, we share common interests. We enjoy being with each other. There are things that maybe we have in common, whether that's a common history or common hobbies, and I get something out of it, you get something out of it. But I'm under no obligation, and neither is the person that I'm a friend with. And you know how life is. From time to time, things, they change. Circumstances change, and I'm sure this is your experience. You've had a friend, and all of a sudden, they got other interests or other hobbies, or you got other interests and you got other hobbies, and you didn't feel obligated. You sort of just, maybe You maintained a casual relationship from time to time, but the friendship you could just, that's how almost all our human relationships are, but not marriage. God's idea in marriage is this, that you would add the force of law, and you would call upon God and make vows, and the vows would go something like this: for better or for worse, in sickness or health, for richer, but also for poorer. Now, with my grocery store, if it stops working out, I just back away. But in marriage, I stand before God, and if it stops working out, guess what? I promise I will not back away. And she promises she will not back away. No matter how bad it gets, we call upon God, we add the force of law. This relationship, we're binding ourselves to one another in every way. Economically, socially, in every way. In every way, we become totally vulnerable to the other person. We totally bind ourselves as a family, as a home. That's the idea in a marriage, and it's really special. It's really awesome. And then God does one more thing. He provides a tremendous gift. Because marriage can be tough. He provides something wonderful, which is sexuality. And that sexuality is like this glue that binds a couple together. It's such a wonderful thing that God does. He provides this glue, and that's what it's for. And that's the reason that the two become one flesh. And anyway, that's the picture of sexuality in the Bible. Now, I'm hearing what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking things like this: Scott, you're just trying to make me feel guilty. I promise you I'm not. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty at all. I'm actually trying to persuade you. I'm trying to persuade you that God has a grander plan for sexuality than what you're thinking. From time to time, I'll hear people say, like, I wish you'd be more open-minded, to which I'm now saying, I wish you'd be more open-minded. Sexuality is it's this tremendous thing that God's given, and it has this grand purpose and grand design. And when Christians talk about sexual integrity, this is what we have in mind. That there be an integrity in your life. Only give your body away when you're willing to give everything else away. When you're willing to say, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in good times and bad, no matter what, even when this doesn't suit me anymore, when you're willing economically and socially and in every other way to give yourself away, then also give your body away. But don't just give your body away to anyone. It makes no sense to say, I'll be totally open and vulnerable with my body, but when it comes to money and everything else, I want to be closed off to you. There's no integrity in your life. And so, anyway, I hope you hear me right. I'm not trying to make anyone here feel guilty. I'm just trying to persuade you there's something so much better. And I wish you'd be open-minded about it. That's one way of looking at it. I hear what else you're thinking. Scott, this is so puritanical. This is so old school. This is so old-fashioned. And don't you know that human beings have urges and you're just being repressive? You Christians, it's not just me, by the way. I just stand here as a representative. You're being repressive. You don't understand human nature. We have needs and wants and desires. And anyway, I recently was drawn to a book. Actually, someone here in the congregation recommended it to me by a Jewish rabbi who talked about human nature in such a way that I thought, boy, this is great. It captures something in the Bible that I'd like to pass along. And here's what it is. It's a view of human nature. And this is what Jewish tradition says. It says when you look at humanity, you should this is a great picture, a rider on a donkey. When you look at the human being, this is a picture that you should come into your mind, a person riding a donkey. And anyway, that's a little weird, so let me explain. This is maybe one way of looking at it. Let's suppose that someone came from another world. So by the way, just because I put a UFO on the board, doesn't mean that I believe in UFOs. I'm making no comment whatsoever on whether there's life on any other planet. I'm just merely making an analogy. Let's say there was someone who came from another planet and they saw this person on a donkey. They might be tempted to think that's one creature. After all, they look and it seems in some way that they're riding together and they're combined. They might be tempted to think that's just one person. But in fact, we'd know, from our experience, that they're making a mistake. There's actually two people. And here's the point. Some of us might be tempted to think, when it comes to human nature, there's just one person in here, when in fact there are two. And until you understand that there are two, you are going to have a very difficult time navigating life. In fact, ever since I read this, I've been saying to my kids all the time, hey, you need to ride your donkey. And I explain this all to them. And so that's a thing in our house now. Maybe it'll become a thing in yours. Hey, you need to ride your donkey. Here's the biblical idea from Genesis chapter 2 about the creation of human beings. The Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Here's the picture that God, when he made human beings, there was something material about us. He formed from the dust of the ground, and he made a creature that, by the way, is not too unlike any material animal. So we've got bones, we've got flesh and blood, we've got hair, a little, right, just like any other animal. We've got eyes, we've got ears, we've got a nose, we perceive. We have urges. We have the urge to eat. We have the urge to drink. We have all kinds of urges, just like any other animal. There's ways in which we're just like a material animal, but we're not just that, because God formed us from the dust of the ground, and now here's the amazing thing. He breathed into our nostrils the breath of life. We're not just a material being, we're also a spiritual being. And because we're a spiritual being, we have a moral an eternal soul that's a part of us. And now here's the thing. It's not just that there's one of us. There's actually two. There's the material animal, so to speak, but then there's this soul, this moral being. And now here's the thought, and this is why Jewish tradition gets in it. Which one should command who? Who should be in charge? Should the animal just run wherever it wants, whatever urge it has, it just goes there? Or should it be that the rider, who's the higher creature, the more noble creature, directs the animal to where it needs to go? Which one's right? And here's the thing. This is why I tell my kids, you need to ride your donkey. Because we all have urges, let's face it. When it comes to any number of issues, there's all kinds of urges we have all the time. But if we just follow those urges, we'll be like the donkey running all over the place. Our life will go nowhere. This is good news from the Bible. We're not, okay, look, our world is telling us we're just animals. We're not just animals. There is a spiritual soul that rides on top this material animal that is in charge and directs our course, which means, guess what? When certain urges arise, it is the responsibility of the rider to say, no, donkey. And anyway, that's why I tell my kids, because I have all kinds of urges I don't like, and I want them to say no. And some of you might need to hear that too. We're not just animals. But I want to say one more thing, because that doesn't explain it all. It'd be like the worst malpractice in a sermon for me to just say, well, look, say no to your urges. That's actually that's not what this Bible passage is saying. I want you to look particularly at Joseph's response. When he's confronted with this temptation, this is what he says. How could I do such a wicked thing, this is in verse 9, and sin, now check this, against God? Here's what I want to say. Most of us, when we fall into temptation, especially sexual temptation, we fall not because the donkey's in charge, so to speak. We actually fall because there's something broken with the rider, with the soul. And that's the story of the Bible, by the way, that when human beings fell into sin, there became something broken with our soul. And actually, I'd like to just draw upon a resource. Probably the sermon that I once read that became for me at least, maybe the most important sermon I've ever read, helped me understand Christianity the very most, and the gospel of Jesus Christ the very most, was a sermon called The Expulsive Power of a New Affection. It was written by a fellow named Thomas Chalmers. He was a 19th century Scottish preacher, and if you're interested, boy, I encourage you, look it up. You can just Google this, you'll find this. It's a bit of a tough read, to be honest with you. It's in like older English in almost every version I can find. It really takes some concentration to get your way through, but the idea he had, so amazing, so important. I'm going to do my best to just simplify it and make it easy. Here's what Thomas Chalmers said. He said, you have to understand this about human beings, that there was a triune God who created us, and because this triune God was a God of love, he actually created us human beings for love. And not just any love, a big love, so that our heart had a capacity to love and have as the object of love the most ultimate thing in the universe, God. This is what our hearts were created for. And so, God was supposed to be the highest priority of our hearts. But if you follow the story of the Bible, here's what happened. We sinned against God. We didn't want him anymore. And we decided that, hey, he's out of there. And so instead, our hearts, which are still made for love and still have this capacity to love and still want to love things, instead of loving God, have substituted something else as our highest priority. And fallen human beings, it can, just about anything. People make almost anything their highest priority, but among the things that they make their highest priority, their greatest love are things like job, status, money, fame, acceptance, some object or possession, or even some person. So this is what we do. Our hearts were made for love. They were made for God. There's this hole in our heart because we've been separated from God. And so instead of putting our heart on God, we put it on some lesser thing. Except that lesser thing can't bear the weight of that hole. And when we make some lesser thing an ultimate thing, we really mess up our lives. So let me give a couple of examples of how this might happen. One example would be something like this. There are some people who, for whatever broken reasons that are inside, they decide to make the pursuit of a romantic relationship the ultimate thing. They want the affection. They want love. They want to be esteemed by someone else. They want to be known by someone else. And so they make that the ultimate or top thing. Because it's the ultimate or top thing, when someone comes along and shows them just a little bit of care or concern, even if it's all the wrong person, guess what ends up happening? They jump at it. And even though in their mind they say this is not the right person, their heart wants it so much that they offer themselves to that person. Well, what winds up happening in your experience? Good stuff or bad stuff? Bad stuff. So it wasn't a match. And this person puts all their hopes on a broken person, and that person can't possibly fulfill the needs of that heart, which has a big hole for God. And not only that, but they're broken and twisted, and they didn't get into this relationship under the same illusion or understanding, and as a result, it's just terrible. And what winds up happening is the relationship breaks apart, which exacerbates the problem. And so guess what? After the relationship breaks apart, someone else comes along, and this someone else may even be worse than the first person. But what does this person do? In your experience, what do? They leap, and they find themselves in another relationship, which is doomed to fail. And, here's the thing. Eventually, people come to their senses. They say to themselves, what have I done? No girl, no guy can fill my needs, and it was stupid of me to think that. And so they try to push that down. Well, here's the thing. As much as you push it down, our hearts are still made for love. And so, actually, it's like whack-a-mole. You know the game whack-a-mole? You hit one down, another one pops up. So what happens is we whack one down, and then some other wrong thing comes up. And so, this is so common. People say, well, I'm done with relationships. I'm sick of that. I'm through with it. They push it down. They say, from now on, it's job. It's career. And, well, that's no better. How many people do you know that just gave everything to career, and in doing so neglected family and messed up their kids and ultimately wind up ruined that way? It's not that any one of these things is a wrong thing. They just aren't ultimate things. And do you know what we need? We need a new love. A new love that can go to the top and put everything else in its place. Now, when I say we need a new love, here's what I want you to see. I told you that chapter 39 looked backwards. It also looks forward. You have to see that Joseph is an advanced presentation of Jesus Christ. Here, I'll show you a couple verses. Philippians chapter 2, verse 7 says this about Jesus. He made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. I mean, it's saying about Jesus, he came from the heavenly heights. He was equal to God, but he was thrust into a low position, taking on the very nature of a slave or servant. Don't you see that's Joseph, right? He was at the top, but he became a slave, a servant. Or look at this one. Isaiah 53, verse 12 says of Jesus, he was numbered with the transgressors. You read the Bible, it's just so clear. Jesus is totally innocent. But at the end of his life, he's hanging on a cross with two criminals on his right and left, numbered with transgressors. Here in this story, don't you see it? Joseph, totally innocent, but where does he wind up? In prison with criminals. Now, Joseph was thrust into this situation by outside forces. But don't you see Jesus thrust himself? Why did he become a slave? Why did he leave the heavenly heights to become a slave? Why was he numbered with transgressors? Why, finally, hanging on the cross between two criminals? Why? Because of love. He loved you. He's affirming you. He's taking the blame for you. He wants to take your place. He wants a relationship with you. And here's the thing. If you get this love, you'll have the ultimate love. And all these other things will get into the right place. We need a love like that, and Jesus offers it. And if your life is just a string of messes because you've made other things ultimate things, it's only at the foot of the cross where it starts to get put back together in a plain and straight way. Anyway, temptation number 1 was short, power. Temptation number 2, I've taken a long time now, sex. Temptation number 3, I'm going to take a short time again, even though it might be the most difficult, the temptation to despair. So in this chapter, Joseph's done everything right. But at the end of it, where is he? Prison. He's done everything right, but life seems to have gone terribly wrong. And I suspect there's any number of us who have either been in a similar situation or are now in a similar situation. We think we've done all the right thing, but we're beaten down by life. We think we've done all the right thing, but we just can't catch a break. And boy, if you're there or if you've been there, the temptation to despair is so strong, to just give up and say, forget God, forget everyone, I wish I could just die. The temptation to despair is so strong. And here's the problem when we find ourselves in that really bad situation where we haven't caught a break and life's beat us down. We may say to ourselves, boy, the reason I'm tempted to despair is because it looks to me like there's no good ending. And in truth, our life is like a book. You know, every day we turn another page, and then we turn another page. And so as a result, we know what's behind us, and we know what's on our present page. What we don't know is what's in the future. We don't know that. We don't have our story. Here's the awesome thing the Bible does. Even though we don't know our story, the Bible says, here, let this be your story for now. See who God is, and let this be your story. I started this last week, so here's how I'm going to conclude today. I just want to finish it. Well, we're not even quite done yet. We're getting there. Here it is. At the end of Joseph's story, he is the prime minister of Egypt, and he is the savior both of his family and the world. There's this worldwide famine that comes. He has this great plan, and he's a prime minister in Egypt. He's the savior of both his family and the world. Tremendous outcome. How did he get there? What was the road? Well, first, there was a broken family where a father was showing favoritism to a son and gave him this robe. He had these dreams, and there was hatred. His brothers hated him. That's the beginning. Then there's Dothan. He goes to check on his brothers in Shechem. They, for whatever reason we don't even know, went on to Dothan, which is remote. And there was a certain person that was there. That's the next part here. Certain man who overheard the brothers saying, we're going there. There was this man, same man, saw Joseph and went after him. Anyway, then he was beat up, thrown into a cistern, and sold off as a slave. As it happened, he wound up in Potiphar's house. And, boy, this is a really important detail. Eventually, he gets thrown in prison. But not just any prison, because Potiphar is one of the most royal officials, he gets thrown in the royal prison. I don't want to give away next week. I mean, you have to come back. But here's what we're going to find out. Because he's in this royal prison, he meets Pharaoh's officials, a baker and a cupbearer. And because he meets them and interprets their dreams, he winds up finally getting into Pharaoh's household. He had to meet those people. He could only meet them in a prison, and not just any prison, a royal prison. So he had to be in Potiphar's house. And finally, in order to get into that prison, he had to be falsely accused. And he had to be imprisoned. It's not just in spite of suffering that Joseph became prime minister and savior of the family and world. It's through suffering. Christians should understand this most. It wasn't just in spite of suffering that God saves us from sins. It's through suffering that he saves us. And I know it's difficult to say this, but if you're in a bad place right now, if you're saying to yourself, as I look out, it just looks like the world's beating me down and I'm never going to get a good shake, I invite you into this story. Let this story become your story. You don't know your ending, but this story tells us that God has a good purpose. He's working everything for our good and for his glory. And although right now you can't see it, he has a plan for each one of us that is more glorious than we dare ask or imagine. And for all those reasons, if you do not have a relationship with Jesus Christ, I just urge you today to surrender your life to him. Let's pray.